This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 299 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Just like 2 weeks ago with Will Fuller, I'm very glad that this past week featured Stefon Diggs. I mean it when I say that anytime a fringe player, or a player that you might consider benching, or a player who's disappointed, but anytime one of those players goes off like that, I really hope that I talked about that player on this show. And fortunately, I did last week with Stefon Diggs. Last week in general was pretty strong, so I'm hoping that things can continue into week 7. Before looking at some players that I'm into more and less than the consensus this week, though, I want to let you guys know about FanDuel's Thursday Million contest that's happening tonight, Thursday night. It's $9 to enter, and it features players who are playing in Thursday night's game between the Chiefs and the Broncos. And the winner of the contest gets $200,000. So head to FanDuel.com and start building your lineup. After looking at rankings this week on Fantasy Pros, I couldn't find a whole lot of quarterbacks that I'm drastically different on versus the consensus ranks. So I figured I'd just highlight some quarterbacks today who you may feel questionable about in order to give you some context. So let's start with Jared Goff. Like I mentioned on this week's 15 Transactions show, you should feel fine with Goff over the next couple of weeks. So that includes this week's game against Atlanta. FanDuel Sportsbook has that game with a 54.5 point over-under. It's being played in a dome, and over the last 3 weeks, the banged-up Falcons secondary has allowed 11 touchdown passes to the combination of Marcus Mariota, Deshaun Watson, and Kyler Murray. The worry with Goff is always what happens if the opposing defense generates a lot of pressure. But Atlanta has a bottom-half pressure rate in the league to go along with the worst sack rate in football. Goff has proven to have a decent enough ceiling this year. It's just that he has these really awful games that can absolutely sink you. But I would be shocked if he has one of those games this week. I like Daniel Jones this week as well. Not as much as Jared Goff, but Jones is the best streaming option available. Now, Patrick Peterson is returning for Arizona, so there's some concern there, but the Cardinals have allowed a top 10 quarterback performance every single week this year, aside from when they faced Russell Wilson. Somehow. And this game between the Giants and Cardinals is a 49.5 point total. That's one of the higher ones that you're going to find this week. The Giants actually have the 4th highest implied team total among all teams this weekend, so I think Danny Dimes is going to be just fine. And Gardner Minshew should be as well. I know he had a down game last week, but Cincinnati, who's already been a bottom 10 team against the pass this year, they're going to be without their starting perimeter cornerbacks. It's definitely a game where Leonard Fournette can and should go absolutely ham. But Minshew's a pretty safe option as well, given the injuries and how bad that Bengals defense has been. And remember, last week was the first time that Gardner Minshew failed to hit 16 fantasy points. Now, on the flip side, I think there are enough reasons to not be in love with Tom Brady this week, or to think that he's more of a QB2 than a QB1. There are injuries to New England's wide receivers, and the Jets' defense is a top half one in yards per attempt allowed. And they've yet to allow a quarterback to rank higher than QB12, which is where Tom Brady finished back in week 3. But they faced Josh Allen, Baker Mayfield, Tom Brady, like I just said, Carson Wentz, and Dak Prescott. And you might think that it's because those quarterbacks didn't have to be all that aggressive because of who they were facing. Because we know the Jets' offense didn't really look the same without Sam Darnold. But those quarterbacks that they faced averaged almost 37 pass attempts per game. Brady didn't look amazing last week, and I'm a little bit worried about this divisional matchup. And then there's Phillip Rivers. Rivers is sort of doing his typical thing, where he just consistently ranks as a high-end QB2, and then he'll magically end up as a QB1 at the end of the year because he didn't get hurt. But he's had multiple games already this year without a touchdown pass, which is somewhat worrisome, and Tennessee's yet to allow a top 12 QB1 performance this year. And they've gone up against pretty decent competition. They faced Baker Mayfield, Jacoby Brissett, Gardner Minshew, Matt Ryan, and Josh Allen. I won't mention Joe Flacco. It's just not the easiest matchup in the world for Phillip Rivers. So you might be able to bench Phillip Rivers for a better option. Tevin Coleman has seen about half of the 49ers running back carries over the last 2 weeks, which are the 2 weeks that he's been back from injury. And it was good to see him used as a receiver this past week against the Rams, where he saw a near 10% target share. Now, the 49ers have been the most run-heavy team in the NFL to start the year. And while that's going to regress a bit, given the fact that they're a little bit more pass-heavy when the game script is neutral, it may not this week, because they're facing Washington and they're 10-point favorites. So Coleman's relatively high rushing share will be of a bigger pie this week because San Francisco is likely to run a lot. And he's a good bet to see goal line work too, because last week alone, he had 4 rushes from within the Rams' 5-yard line. I'm really hoping this is Royce Freeman's week. He's one of the bigger positive touchdown regression candidates right now. Given his yardage total, he should have about 2.7 touchdowns, but he hasn't scored yet. His usage really isn't that bad. Yes, Phillip Lindsay is the running back that you want on the Denver Broncos, but Freeman has seen 44% of Denver's running back carries and a really solid 13.8% target share this year. He's low-key providing a nice floor each and every week. He just hasn't found the end zone, so the ceiling's been lacking. But maybe a matchup against Kansas City's defense will help. The Chiefs have allowed a 54% success rate, or the percentage of positive expected points runs made by a running back according to NumberFire's expected points model, and that 54% mark is by far the highest in the league. It's easily the worst in football. There's no better matchup for a running back on the ground than a running back facing the Kansas City Chiefs. So I think that Royce Freeman is a decent play as a result. Someone who's kind of a deeper play is Devin Singletary. It sounds like he's going to be back this week, and he gets a matchup against Miami, a team that's allowing the most fantasy points to running backs this season. Singletary, in one of his 2 games played this year, saw 70% of Buffalo's offensive snaps. And while he might not be given a full workload right away, he should see enough touches to warrant a flex play this week. Now, 2 running backs I'm lower on this week, I'm lower on for similar reasons. They've both gotten underwhelming and unpredictable usage. And I hate that when plugging guys into my fantasy lineup. The first one's Damian Williams. I talked about this on my 15 transaction show this week, but I don't know how you confidently play Williams when he saw 90% of the team's rushes 2 weeks ago and it followed that up with barely any work last week. If the Chiefs decide to feature Damian Williams, then yeah, he's going to be an RB2 this week. That's how things work. But we don't know how that workload is exactly going to be split up. That's what makes it so difficult to play someone like Damian Williams right now. And then I want to take a second and talk about Joe Mixon. His production has been really bad this year. And what's most irritating is that he only has an 8% target share. I don't mind the matchup against Jacksonville, but I think just given his workload and how he's performed, he's more of a low-end RB2 rather than a mid-range one. And keep in mind, he's ranked higher than RB28 just once this season. Every Rams wide receiver is in play this week, but I wanted to specifically highlight Brandin Cooks because he really hasn't brought the goods this season. He has just 3 double-digit PPR performances, but to be fair, he was concussed in 1 game, and last week, the Rams only had like 12 passing yards. But I love this matchup against Atlanta for reasons that I talked about earlier with Jared Goff. Goff should have enough time in the pocket, which means potential throws down the field for Brandin Cooks. Because Cooks has by far the highest average depth of target this year among the big 3 wide receivers for LA. Atlanta's also allowed 18 deep ball completions this season, or completions on throws that travel 15 or more air yards. That's just 4 off the league lead. So Brandin Cooks is a great play. And if you've got Michael Gallup, you have to play Michael Gallup this week. He's honestly probably a wide receiver 1 if Amari Cooper doesn't play. The Eagles have been horrendous against opposing wide receivers, and specifically perimeter wide receivers. On the year, they've actually seen the lowest rate of targets go to the slot because teams are using their outside receivers so much against them. They're exploiting a matchup. So if Amari Cooper can't go, I actually prefer Devin Smith to Randall Cobb this week. But Michael Gallup should be able to go absolutely nuts against a team that's allowing the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Now, even though the Cardinals are getting Patrick Peterson back, he's likely not going to shadow Golden Tate into the slot. And that's where Golden Tate's played 90% of his snaps this season. So that gives him a really advantageous matchup against a team that's given up 6 slot touchdowns and 762 yards to slot receivers this year. Those are some of the highest marks in the league. And almost 40% of the targets against Arizona are going to that area of the field. So Golden Tate, without a ton of options in that offense, he's a pretty strong play, along with Evan Ingram. But everyone knows to play Evan Ingram. And then in that same game, if Christian Kirk ends up playing, and it sounded like he was close to playing last week, then I think that you can play him. The Giants are giving up the 3rd most points to opposing wideouts this year, though they've been okay against slot guys. But with Christian Kirk, when he's been healthy this year, he's seen over 22% of Arizona's targets. He's going to be involved in that passing attack. And you should always buy volume, especially in a game with a decent over-under. Now, on the flip side, I'm a little bit nervous about Allen Robinson this week. He'll likely be shadowed by Marshawn Lattimore. And over the last 3 weeks, Amari Cooper, Mike Evans, and DJ Chark were all held in check against Lattimore. Cooper was wide receiver 34, Evans didn't even catch a pass, and Chark was wide receiver 45 this past week. It's a brutal matchup for Robinson coming out of the bye. And it's tough to love Terry McLaurin this week as well. San Francisco's been a top 10 team at preventing points to wide receivers. Washington has the second lowest implied team total on this week's slate, and McLaurin has touchdown regression heading his way. We can't expect him to keep up the pace of scoring a touchdown for every 82 receiving yards. That's about double the efficiency of what we've seen over the last 5 years from an average wide receiver. And it's not like Washington has some good offensive situation. So I worry about Terry McLaurin in this matchup. Now, Gerald Everett disappointed last week, but I'm trying to get Rams offensive players into my lineups when I can. And I think that you can feel good about Everett as a tight end 1 this week. Literally everyone in the Rams offense was bad in week 6. But the good news is that Everett had another game with a 20% target share. So that gives him 4 games with a double-digit target share this year. Half of those games have been over 17%. That's not bad at all for a tight end. In a high-scoring game, I think he's a good play. And I also kind of like Dallas Goedert. I talked about him on yesterday's 10 Trend show, but his snap rate's been increasing now that he's been healthy, and he's seen 10% or more of Philly's targets in each of the last 3 games. So if you're in a pinch, I think that he's a fine option. And I like adding him over other streamers because he has way more upside than other guys off the waiver wire, given what could happen to his workload if Zach Ertz were to get hurt. Now, I'll be honest with you guys. Defense is an S show this week. I think the Packers are in play at home as favorites against the Raiders. I don't mind Tennessee at home against the Chargers. And if you're really in a tough spot, you could go with this week's 15 transactions recommendation and go with the Chiefs against Denver. They're on the road and it's on Thursday night, which kind of sucks, but the Broncos are in the bottom half of the league in pretty much every total offensive category. My main fear with Kansas City is that I do think that Denver's going to be able to run on them. That means fewer opportunities for sacks and turnovers. But they're probably the most traditional streaming option in a tough week 7. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And search for me on Twitter as well. I'm at Late Round QB. Give me a follow there. Thanks, everyone. Tomorrow's the Mailbag Show, so I'll talk to you then.